color management. What is it? Well, essentially color management is all about managing the available color inside of your image throughout various devices through its life cycle. Now, it typically starts once you capture whatever kind of scene you want, whether it's on paper or what you see with your eyes, on some kind of a digital format. And that can be done using your scanner, or it can be done using your camera. Now, let's say we have captured an image at this point. So we have whatever was available to us with our naked eye, all the colors we could see, we have just took essentially a snapshot of that, right? So we have set the available color in, we have kind of logged the available color inside of that scene into a digital file. And whatever we've done at this point is whatever color we have locked, whatever we have at this point, we have to wisely manage throughout various devices so that we don't lose that color unless we want to throw away some of it. And that's what color management is about. So once you have either scan or capture some kind of a scene with your camera, what happens after that? Well, let's say we have a raw file, right? Might want to use a program like Lightroom who can open up that raw file and manage the color inside. And then we might use Bridge and Camera Raw workflow. Whatever the type of user you are, once you manage your color inside of a raw file, you have to decide how you're going to transfer that file to the next application. Typically that's Photoshop, where we refine our edits. And we are still managing our color, right? We have to be very careful that we don't throw away the color we still might need for our output device, which means that we have to know, or at least assume, what the output device will be, whether it's going to be print or web or both. But here's an important part of color management as well. Now, one part is dealing with managing the available color which we had once we captured our image. The other very important element is once we done correcting the color inside of an image, the process we call usually color correction or color toning or color grading, depending on your terminology. So once you like what you see on your screen on your Photoshop and you've done your edits, what happens after that? Well, you have to manage your color, not only the available color at this point, but also you want to make sure that the color doesn't change appearance in your image throughout various devices. And that's managing appearance. It's still part of the color management process, but it deals with the appearance of color. So for example, you might post your images on the web. In this case, you have one responsibility, and that makes sure that what you see on your monitor, on a calibrated monitor, and when I say calibrated, calibration essentially means that you set your monitor, you put it into predetermined state. You essentially measure what the offset of color is on an uncalibrated monitor. You measure what the color of, you know what the color should be on a calibrated monitor, you calculate the difference and you save that as a profile for your monitor. So the measurement process, that's called calibration. The profiling process means simply that we save our findings into a small piece of data we call profile, and that profile then gets read into our operating system every time we boot, and it displays color in an objective way. And this is a state that can be reproduced in another monitor. Right. The second part of that is that we have to embed the profile of the image inside of an image so that we know how much available color is there in an image. Why? Because we want to make sure that somebody who also has a calibrated and profile monitor somewhere across the world can use the data inside of our image, which is essentially a profile embedded inside of an image, so that it can read that profile, that it knows how to display an image. But in order to do that, you also need another component, and that is application that can read those profiles. So first you need to set your monitor in a predefined repeatable state. That's calibration and profiling. Then you need to embed a profile inside of your image so that other people who have the same calibrated monitor can read the image properly. And then you need an application that can read those colors, and it's color managed. Well, that's the problem with the web. First of all, the first component, most people don't have calibrated monitors, therefore they could have a color cast on their monitor which shows a different color of an image, right? Problem number two, most people don't use the kind of browsers that can read color manage their images. And 3, most images online don't have embedded color profiles. So those 3 components are critical for a color managed workflow, and yet many people online don't have them, don't use them, don't know they need them. So that's why we refer to web as being by and large uncolor managed environment. So when you post your images online, you can make sure that those images look the same on your monitor, on your Photoshop, and on your browser. But what happens after that with all these different people, that's something you cannot control. It's just the way it is, right? You cannot take a gun, put the gun to their head, everybody in the planet, and say, hey, you need to calibrate your monitor, you need to set the proper ambient lighting, you need to profile, and you can't do that. So the best you can do is make sure that it works on your monitor, that it's objective, that it's a repeatable state, and then it's up to them to repeat that and see the color the way you want it to. So that's something we need to consider when we're done editing our file. How do we keep the color appearance the same? Again, we have another problem with different mobile devices, which are getting more and more popular, right? For example, more and more people are using their smartphones to review images, whether it's browsing the internet or viewing their files on a email application within the phone. Also, we have to think about the different tablets. Very popular is, of course, iPad. So there are a lot of photographers who use their iPads to show images to their clients during the shoot and maybe even after the shoot, because it's a pretty cool experience. You can swipe through images, they're easily changed, you can easily upload and download the images, and so on and so forth. As well as on the as for retouchers, there is a problem. Let's say you create a file, right, and you send it off to a client, which then reviews the file on their email application within the phone. Well, that may not be color managed as well. So it's a similar problem as we have with our web images. We have to take that into account. And of course, you have to consider that there is another monitor that displays color potentially in a different way. Because here's the thing, if you're a photographer, you will see a scene probably with your naked eye. You will capture that scene with your camera. You might see it on your little LCD display on your camera. You might see it for the rest of the journey, for the rest of the life cycle inside of a monitor screen, a desktop monitor, and then you might see it even in print. But as a retouchers, especially as freelance global working retouchers, a lot of times our monitor is the only view, is the only window into the world of color, right? We might work with people all over the world, and we only get those images and see them and see them from start to finish on our screens. And when we send them off to another person who has a different monitor, those colors could be off, could be completely different, and we have to take that into account. We'll talk about that later in more detail. So that's another thing we have to take into account. And up until this point, we talked about different digital devices, which work essentially in an RGB color space, and they work by producing their own light, by emitting their own light. When you're working with printers, which you might also want to do and often do, you have to take into account that printers don't produce their own light. They reflect whatever is in the ambient. So you have to take into account that a printer produces color in a completely different way. And because of this, they have certain physical limitations, and they also have different factors that influence how we perceive color on paper, right? It's paper and ink combination. It's the abilities of that printer to kind of produce certain range of colors or not, and it's also the ambient light. So what are the properties, reflective properties of that paper? How much ink can it absorb, and what's the ambient light, how it will reflect against that paper to give us the perception of the color? All of that is something we have to take into account because it changes the appearance of the color of the image. So we also have to worry about if we're sending our files, as a retoucher for example, we might send our files, or a photographer, to a printing press to be printed in a magazine. That creates another set of problems, because not only is the printing press limiting in the way it can produce color, just physically limiting as opposed to our monitor, but also there is another person in the workflow that we have to take into account, and communication is very, very important, right? Because there could be a designer working for that magazine who will take our image that we so carefully retouched and managed, and he can screw up the color for us because he doesn't know what he's doing, or just made a mistake, or wasn't a good communication, and so on and so forth. Because you can't just print our image just like that into a magazine, right? It first has to be brought into a layout application such as InDesign. It has to be put in a layout of the magazine, and you have to put all those texts and all that. So somebody else is also managing the color inside of our image. We need to take that into account. And of course, we also might send our image to a local printer, and they might have different limitations because of the printer, or different standards, or communication could be a problem. So we have to take that into account as well. And throughout all of this life cycle of color that lives within our image, we start by managing the color inside of our image, available color, throughout the process. But when we hit the point where we know how the image needs to look, at this point on, we also have to worry about the appearance of the color inside of our image. So it's kind of like a two-way process in a sense. Whatever the case, we got to make sure that our image throughout all of these digital devices, as well as these print type devices, remains as close to what we want it to be as possible. And that's what color management is all about: managing available color in our image throughout various devices, and once we're done editing, managing the appearance of our final edit throughout these various devices.